1,400 nautical miles. That is the distance between the tanker the United States Navy just seized and the nearest American base. 1 destroyer, 1 helicopter, 6 operators on a hostile deck. The closest reinforcement, 6 hours away. The seizure itself took 4 hours. Holding the ship afterward is taking weeks, and the cost of holding it has already exceeded the value of every barrel of oil inside the hull. That equation is what this video is about. For 2 years, this channel has shown you the math of the Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile choke point where the world's most expensive navy meets the world's cheapest threat matrix. We showed you the mines. We showed you the fast boats. We showed you the cost asymmetry equations that make Hormuz the most dangerous waterway on Earth. But here's the variable nobody was watching. Iran does not move all of its oil through Hormuz. The shipments Tehran most wants to hide take the long route, east through the Gulf of Oman, south along the Pakistani coastline, and out into the open Indian Ocean. By the time a sanctioned tanker reaches the northern Arabian Sea, it is 1,400 nautical miles from 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, 2,200 miles from Diego Garcia, and surrounded by a body of water so vast that the entire Mediterranean fits inside it 3 times. Iran built its sanctions evasion corridor on a single assumption: the United States Navy patrols choke points. Open ocean is unpatrolled. Open ocean is safe. That assumption died in April 2026. USS Nitze, DDG-94, an Arleigh Burke-class Flight 2A destroyer, had been tracking the tanker for days. Signals intelligence had flagged the vessel weeks earlier. Iranian-flagged. Running with its automatic identification system transponder broadcasting coordinates that placed it 600 miles from its actual position. A technique sanctions evaders have used since 2019. Spoofing location data to create ghost tracks that confuse commercial monitoring services. But this time, the intelligence picture was different. This tanker was not just carrying crude oil. The National Security Agency had intercepted communications, suggesting it was carrying something else. Something that had nothing to do with petroleum, and everything to do with how the IRGC Navy coordinates operations across 2,000 miles of open water. To confirm that intelligence, the Navy had to do something it had never attempted at this distance from friendly territory. It had to put a boarding team on a non-compliant vessel in the middle of the Indian Ocean, with no backup, no nearby port, and no extraction plan that did not involve the same single helicopter that delivered them. Here is why this almost did not happen. A visit, board, search, and seizure operation, VBSS, in the Persian Gulf is a controlled problem. You have carrier-based air cover within 20 minutes. You have 3 or 4 surface combatants within visual range. A Coast Guard cutter stands by to receive the seized vessel. Transit time to a friendly port in Bahrain or the UAE is measured in hours, sometimes less. The variables are known. The risks are bounded. Now, strip away every one of those variables. In the northern Indian Ocean, USS Nitze was operating alone. No carrier within 1,800 miles. No Coast Guard cutter within 9 days of steaming. No allied port that had agreed, or would agree, to accept a seized Iranian tanker. That last variable is the one that mattered most, and the Navy did not have an answer for it at the time of the boarding. They launched the operation anyway. The tanker's crew refused radio commands on the international distress and calling frequency. Nitze transmitted on channel 16 7 times over 40 minutes. No response. That part is not unusual. Roughly 4 out of 10 sanctions interdictions begin with non-compliance. What was unusual was what happened next. The tanker changed course. Not once, 3 times in 90 minutes, each correction angling the vessel toward the Pakistani coast. At 12 nautical miles from Pakistan's territorial waters, the legal authority for a boarding under international maritime law evaporates. The tanker's master knew exactly what he was doing. he was running for the line. Nitze's commanding officer had a window measured in minutes, not hours. The destroyer was making 30 knots to maintain a blocking position off the tanker's port bow. The tanker was making 14 knots southeast. Every minute of indecision shrank the legal window by another quarter mile. The MH-60R Seahawk launched from Nitze's flight deck with the VBSS team aboard. 6 operators from a Coast Guard law enforcement detachment, a LEDET, embedded with the destroyer specifically for interdiction missions. These are not Navy SEALs. They are Coast Guard maritime law enforcement specialists, trained in evidence preservation, vessel search procedures, and the legal framework that turns a military boarding into an enforceable seizure. The distinction matters. A military boarding without law enforcement authority produces a diplomatic incident. A LEDET boarding produces a court case. The helicopter covered the distance to the tanker in under 8 minutes. The team fast-roped onto the bridge wing while the vessel was still making 14 knots. Wind across the deck at that speed, 25 to 30 knots, gusting higher off the superstructure. The fast rope drops in those conditions are among the most physically demanding insertions in the maritime operations playbook. And here is the math that made the next 90 seconds the most dangerous of the entire operation. A 6-man VBSS team on a hostile vessel, in the first minute and a half after insertion, is the most exposed military unit on the planet. They are standing on an unfamiliar deck. The crew, 25 merchant sailors who may or may not be armed, who may or may not include IRGC personnel, is somewhere inside the superstructure. The helicopter that delivered the team has already banked away to establish an overwatch orbit at 500 feet. There is no cover. There is no fallback position. If the crew resists with firearms, the extraction timeline stretches from minutes to hours. The crew did not resist with firearms. They resisted with time. Every hatch into the superstructure was locked from the inside. The engine room was barricaded. Compartments throughout the vessel had been sealed with mechanisms that required cutting tools the LEDET team did not carry. 4 hours. That is how long it took 6 operators to methodically breach, clear, and secure a 300-meter tanker compartment by compartment, deck by deck, while USS Nitze circled at 2,000 yards with its Mark 45 5-inch gun trained on the waterline and its SPY-1D radar scanning for any Iranian surface contact within 200 nautical miles. I spent hours going through the initial operational reports that surfaced through CENTCOM's public affairs channels, and one detail kept nagging me. At the 2-hour mark, the LEDET team leader radioed Nitze requesting additional personnel. The destroyer had none to send. Every available sailor was already manning a combat watch station. The team leader's next transmission was a single word: understood. That is what operating 1,400 miles from your nearest base sounds like. You do not get reinforcements. You get understood. But what they found below deck made every minute of that risk worthwhile. The crude oil was there. Approximately 700,000 barrels of Iranian heavy crude sitting in the tanker's cargo tanks, worth roughly $56 million at current market rates. Under Executive Order 13,846 and its 2025 amendments, that cargo alone justified the seizure. Sanctions violated. Case closed. Tanker impounded. Except the case was not closed. It was just starting. In the communications compartment aft of the bridge, behind a door that took the LEDET team 45 minutes to breach, the boarding team found 4 encrypted radio terminals. Military-grade hardware, hardwired into the ship's antenna array through a dedicated cable run that had been installed after the vessel's original construction. You could see where the bulkhead had been cut and re-welded to accommodate the routing. Here is the number that mattered. A standard commercial oil tanker carries 3 communication systems: a VHF marine radio for short-range coordination, a satellite communications terminal for long-range contact with the vessel's owner, and an AIS transponder for position reporting. 3 systems. Standard maritime configuration. This tanker had 7. The 4 additional terminals were operating on frequency bands consistent with IRGC Navy coordination networks. The same frequencies that American SIGINT platforms aboard EP-3E Ares aircraft and ground stations in Bahrain had been intercepting across the Arabian Sea for more than a year. The signals were there. The intelligence community knew the network existed. What they could not determine was where the transmissions were originating from. The signals appeared to come from open ocean, from coordinates that changed daily, from platforms that did not match any known Iranian naval vessel. Now, they knew why. The transmissions were coming from tankers. Let me show you what that means in operational terms, because the architecture of this network is what makes it so hard to see. Iran's IRGC Navy operates dozens of fast attack craft, armed dhows, and surveillance fishing vessels across the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman. These are small platforms, 20 to 50 meters in length, with communications equipment limited by their size and power generation. A fast attack craft's radio has an effective range of 30 to 50 nautical miles on a clear day, less in heavy weather, to coordinate operations across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Those small boats need relay stations. Fixed relay stations on Iranian soil are easy targets. The NSA knows where they are. The Air Force can jam them. In a conflict, they are destroyed in the first hours. But a relay station that moves, a relay station that looks like a 300-meter commercial tanker, that flies a legitimate flag, that carries a legitimate cargo, that changes position every single day. That platform is functionally invisible to every surveillance system designed to track military threats. For at least 14 months, this tanker and an unknown number of vessels like it had been transiting the Indian Ocean, carrying sanctioned crude oil in one direction and carrying tactical communications relay capability in every direction simultaneously. The oil revenue paid for the intelligence mission. The intelligence mission, by coordinating IRGC fast boat patrols that could warn of approaching warships, protected the oil. That is not a smuggling operation. That is a naval communications architecture disguised as commerce. And the United States Navy had just captured a piece of it intact. Subscribe to Navy Strikeforce, because what we just showed you is not a tanker seizure. It is the moment the Navy pulled one thread and found the entire fabric attached to it. Now, run the larger numbers, because the seizure itself is only the first variable, and not even the most expensive one. The moment Nitze's LEDETT secured the tanker and transmitted the intelligence findings to 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, 2 separate clocks started. The first was diplomatic. Within 6 hours, Iran's foreign ministry issued a formal statement calling the seizure, and this is a direct quote, an act of state piracy on the high seas, in violation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and every principle of sovereign maritime commerce. Tehran demanded immediate return of the vessel, its cargo, and its crew. The statement used the word piracy 4 times in 3 paragraphs. The second clock was military. Within 12 hours of the seizure, the IRGC Navy repositioned 2 Muj-class frigates, the Sahand and the Dina, from their home port at Bandar Abbas through the Strait of Hormuz and into the Gulf of Oman. Their projected course, based on commercial satellite tracking that every open-source intelligence analyst on the planet was watching in real time, put them in the northern Arabian Sea within 72 hours. And here is the problem that nobody at CENTCOM had adequately war-gamed. You have captured a 300-meter tanker in open ocean. It cannot move under its own power. The LEDET team shut down the main engines as standard precautionary procedure to prevent the crew from attempting to retake control and sail for Iranian waters. You need a tug to move it. The nearest American contracted ocean tug was in Bahrain, a 9-day transit at towing speed. You need a port that will accept the vessel. Oman said no within 4 hours. The UAE communicated nothing through official channels, which in Gulf diplomatic language means no. Djibouti, 1,600 miles to the southwest, was a possibility, but required State Department coordination with the Djiboutian government that would take days to formalize. So you have a destroyer, a captured tanker that cannot move, no tug, no port, and 2 Iranian frigates steaming toward you at 28 knots. What would you have done as Nitze's commanding officer, standing on the bridge wing of a $1.8 billion destroyer, tied to a stationary target in open water, watching 2 hostile contacts close the range at 650 nautical miles per day? Run the engagement math first, because it matters. USS Nitze is an Arleigh Burke Flight 2. A. Displacement, 9,200 tons. 96 vertical launch cells loaded with a mix of SM-2 and SM-6 air defense missiles, Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, and ESSM point defense interceptors. The Aegis combat system, Spy-1, D-radar, cooperative engagement capability, automated threat assessment. In a one-on-one engagement against a Mauj-class frigate, the outcome is not in question. The Mauj displaces 1,500 tons. It carries 4 Nor anti-ship missiles, essentially reverse-engineered Chinese C-802s with a range of 120 kilometers. Nitze carries weapons that outrange, outperform, and outnumber everything Iran has ever put to sea. But here is the variable that inverts the equation. Nitze cannot leave the tanker. The tanker cannot move. And a destroyer anchored to a stationary object has surrendered its single greatest tactical advantage, the ability to maneuver. An Arleigh Burke at 30 knots is one of the most survivable surface combatants ever built. An Arleigh Burke at 0 knots, holding station next to a 300-meter target that cannot evade, is a defender with a fixed position. Every doctrine manual in the Navy says the same thing. A fixed position is a losing position in open ocean warfare. And here is where the cost asymmetry flips in a direction that should concern every budget analyst in the Pentagon. Iran did not need to sink Nitze. Iran did not even need to fire on Nitze. Iran needed to create a standoff that lasted long enough for the diplomatic pressure to become unbearable. 2 frigates loitering at 50 nautical miles from a seized tanker in international waters, violating no law, making no threat, broadcasting on open channels, just present, just visible, just close enough to make every CNN headline read, U.S.-Iran naval standoff in Indian Ocean. That is not a military strategy. That is a public relations strategy executed with warships, and it costs almost nothing. Here is the take that will probably get us criticism. The Navy's operational planning for this seizure was tactically flawless and strategically incomplete. The boarding was textbook. The intelligence haul was extraordinary. But the question of what happens on day 2, when you own a ship you cannot move, in a sea you cannot control, with an adversary who does not need to fight you to win. That question was not answered before the helicopter launched. It was answered in real time, under pressure, with Iranian frigates closing at 28 knots. We showed you how the IRGC builds layered defense networks in the video on Hormuz mine warfare. What we showed you there was the choke point strategy. Mines, fast boats, shore-based missiles, all concentrated in a 21-mile corridor. What we did not show you was the blue water component, the part that extends Iran's awareness and coordination capability across thousands of miles of open ocean using platforms that nobody was looking for, because nobody expected Iran to operate a naval intelligence network disguised as a merchant fleet. The breakthrough came 48 hours after the seizure, and it came not from the tanker, but from Fort Meade. NSA analysts extracted routing tables from the 4 captured terminals. Those tables contained frequency hopping schedules, relay node identifiers, and, critically, approximate patrol routes for every other vessel in the network. The total count, 11 additional tankers and cargo vessels operating as IRGC communications relays across the Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Oman, and the Arabian Sea. One ship gave the United States the blueprint for the entire network, and CENTCOM's response was not what you would expect. They did not seize the other 11. That would have required naval assets that simply do not exist in sufficient numbers across an ocean that stretches 6,200 miles from Africa to Australia. Even dedicating every destroyer in Fifth Fleet to interdiction operations would cover less than 15% of the relevant search area. The response was quieter, and in the long run, far more devastating. They let the network keep running. Here is the counterintuitive logic, and this is the number that matters more than any missile cost or fuel expenditure in this entire story. If you seize every relay node, Iran rebuilds. New frequencies, new protocols, new vessels. You buy 6 months of disruption, maybe a year, before a new network is operational, and you are back to intercepting signals you cannot geolocate. But if you leave the network intact, if you let every relay node continue transmitting on the frequencies and schedules you now possess, you own it. Every tactical communication the IRGC Navy sends through that network is readable. Every operational order, every coordination signal, every logistics request for fuel, ammunition, or spare parts. Collected at the point of transmission, decrypted using the keys extracted from the captured terminals, translated, and filed at the National Security Agency before the intended recipient has even acknowledged receipt. The $56 million tanker became the most cost-effective intelligence platform in CENTCOM's inventory. Not because of what it carried, because of what it revealed. That is not a limitation. That is an advantage. And it is an advantage that only exists because someone at CENTCOM was smart enough to ask a question that most military planners never consider. Is the thing you captured worth more intact than destroyed? Type relay in the comments if you think the intelligence windfall was worth more than the oil. The 72-hour diplomatic crisis ended the way these confrontations usually end. Not with a resolution, but with a careful, face-saving reposition by both sides. Iran's 2 frigates reached the northern Arabian Sea and took up station 80 nautical miles southeast of the captured tanker. They held that position for 11 days. They made no hostile maneuvers. They launched no weapons. They broadcast continuous warnings on Channel 16 and on IRGC-affiliated social media channels that any attempt to move the Iranian vessel constitutes an act of aggression against the Islamic Republic. CENTCOM's response was to divert USS Bataan, LHD-5, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship, from scheduled exercises in the western Indian Ocean. Bataan arrived on station 96 hours after the initial seizure, bringing with it an embarked Marine Expeditionary Unit, 2 additional Arleigh Burke destroyers, and a Ticonderoga-class cruiser. The cost of that diversion, calculated across adjusted operational tempo, fuel consumption, and canceled exercises involving 3 partner nations, approximately $60 million. The tanker was eventually towed to a port facility in Djibouti. The transit took 14 days under escort. The crew was repatriated to Iran through an Omani diplomatic channel that neither Tehran nor Washington has publicly acknowledged. Here is the final tally, and every number in it matters. 1 tanker seizure, $56 million in captured crude oil, 1 intelligence breakthrough, 11 relay nodes mapped, an entire maritime communications architecture compromised and silently exploited, 1 diplomatic crisis, $60 million in fleet repositioning and diversion costs, 1 strategic precedent established. The United States Navy will conduct sanctions enforcement in open ocean, not just choke points. And 1 strategic question that remains unanswered. Can the United States sustain interdiction operations across the 28 million square miles of the Indian Ocean? Or was this a single, unrepeatable demonstration? A proof of concept that works once and then becomes a case study Iran uses to redesign every evasion corridor it operates. The Pentagon says Nitze proved the model. Tehran says Nitze proved the cost. The arithmetic supports both conclusions, and that is the problem with equations that produce two valid answers. Someone has to decide which one to believe before the next tanker sails. We showed you the seizure. We showed you what was hidden inside the hull. We showed you the intelligence windfall and the diplomatic crisis it triggered. What we have not shown you yet is what Iran is building, right now in shipyards along the Makran coast, to make sure the next relay network cannot be captured. That is the next video. Subscribe to Navy Strikeforce. We do not celebrate weapons. We calculate whether they work.